Ladies and gentlemen, history has often been shaped not only by the mighty empires and global superpowers, but also by leaders who emerge from unexpected places, carrying with them the hopes of millions and the burdens of transformation. In 2025, the world has turned its gaze toward a young leader from West Africa, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, whose bold actions and uncompromising defense of his nation's sovereignty have sparked debates across international arenas. The very mention that his name might be linked to a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize has stirred both excitement and controversy, for it challenges the established narratives of what peace, leadership, and justice truly mean in a multipolar world. To understand why such a nomination is even being discussed, one must delve deeply into his story, his vision, his country's struggle, and the broader global context in which he has risen. Burkina Faso, once known as Upper Volta under colonial rule, has for decades stood at the margins of global attention, overshadowed by conflict, poverty, and underdevelopment. Yet the country is also rich in cultural heritage, abundant in natural resources, and filled with a resilient people whose determination has resisted centuries of exploitation. In recent years, Burkina Faso has been plagued by instability, terrorist insurgencies, and economic hardships worsened by external influences and unfair trade structures. Into this volatile environment stepped Ibrahim Traoré, a young military officer who, unlike many leaders who rise to power through decades of politics, burst onto the scene with sudden force, capturing the imagination of his people with his youthful energy and his uncompromising rhetoric. Traoré came to power not merely through ambition, but through necessity, or so his supporters argue. In a time when Burkina Faso's territorial integrity was under assault, when rural communities faced terror from armed groups, and when international alliances seemed insufficient or exploitative, his military-led takeover was framed not as a grab for power, but as a rescue mission for a nation on the brink. Critics might describe him as authoritarian, yet supporters describe him as the very embodiment of a liberator who prioritizes the nation over foreign interests. It is this narrative of liberation, sovereignty, and dignity that has fueled discussions of his potential candidacy for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2025. The Nobel Peace Prize, long regarded as the pinnacle of recognition for individuals or organizations advancing peace, has itself been subject to debate and controversy. From its earliest days, the award has walked a delicate balance between ideals and geopolitics, honoring figures such as Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King Jr. on the one hand, while facing criticism for decisions that many argue reflected Western biases or political maneuvering. To imagine Ibrahim Traoré's name in that same lineage is to understand how the definition of peace is evolving in the 21st century. No longer is peace defined merely as the absence of war. It is increasingly understood as the pursuit of justice, the defense of sovereignty, the establishment of dignity for oppressed peoples, and the empowerment of nations' long-kept independency. In examining Traoré's leadership, one cannot ignore his emphasis on independence from Western financial institutions and military alliances. He has spoken forcefully against the role of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, accusing them of ensnaring African nations in cycles of debt and dependency. He has resisted the influence of foreign troops whose presence, while framed as supportive in the fight against terrorism, has in his view undermined national sovereignty. Instead, Traoré has sought to strengthen regional alliances within Africa, promoting cooperation with neighboring countries such as Mali and Niger in building a self-reliant security framework. For many Africans, this stance is not only refreshing but revolutionary, as it embodies a refusal to accept the status quo of perpetual dependency on external powers. At the heart of the Nobel Peace Prize nomination discussion is the question, can resistance itself be an act of peace? When a leader defends his country's sovereignty against exploitation, is he advancing peace by preventing further destabilization, or is he provoking conflict by challenging global powers? Supporters argue that Traoré's actions are a necessary step toward true peace, for peace cannot exist without justice and independence. They liken his struggle to those of past leaders who confronted colonial domination and systemic oppression. In this sense, Traore is framed as a modern anti-colonial figure, someone who seeks to break the chains of economic and political subjugation. His speeches have often carried a tone of urgency and defiance, yet also of inspiration. He calls upon the youth of Africa to rise, to reclaim their dignity, to value their land and resources, and to resist being pawns in a global game dictated by others. This resonates deeply across the continent, where populations are overwhelmingly young, ambitious, and frustrated with decades of underdevelopment despite the immense wealth of Africa's soil. The idea that one of their own could not only rise to power, but also be recognized on the world stage with a Nobel nomination has ignited a sense of pride and possibility. Yet the debate is not without controversy. International critics point to the fact that Traore came to power through a military takeover, bypassing democratic processes. They argue that the Nobel Prize, historically associated with figures who promoted dialogue, reconciliation, and democracy, risks undermining its credibility if awarded to someone whose rise did not stem from electoral legitimacy. Skeptics also question the effectiveness of his policies, noting that Burkina Faso remains plagued by security challenges, economic hardships, and humanitarian crises. Is it too early, they ask, to consider him a peacemaker when his leadership is still so new and the outcomes of his strategies remain uncertain? Despite these critiques, the symbolism of a Nobel nomination carries weight far beyond the individual. It reflects a growing recognition that the definitions of peace and justice must evolve to fit the realities of our world today. In an era where global inequality, neocolonial exploitation, and financial manipulation dominate international relations, peace cannot simply mean avoiding armed conflict. For many, peace now means self-determination, dignity, and the right to decide one's future free from coercion. By this standard, Traoré's stance against exploitation and his fight for sovereignty become acts of peace in themselves, even if they are expressed through unconventional means. The international community is sharply divided on how to respond to the possibility of his nomination. Western governments, wary of losing influence in West Africa, view his rhetoric and actions with suspicion. They worry that honoring Traoré with such a prize would embolden other leaders to resist Western frameworks, accelerating a shift in global power dynamics. On the other hand, nations in Africa, Asia, and even parts of Latin America see him as a symbol of multipolarity, someone who embodies the idea that global leadership need not always emerge from the established centers of power. For them, his recognition would mark a turning point, an acknowledgement that voices from the global South can shape the future of humanity. To fully appreciate the magnitude of this moment, one must also reflect on the history of the Nobel Prize itself. It has often served as both a recognition of achievement and a statement of values. When awarded to Martin Luther King Jr., it was a statement against racial injustice. When awarded to Nelson Mandela, it was a recognition of reconciliation and the triumph over apartheid. When awarded to Malala Yousafzai, it was a recognition of the universal right to education and the courage of youth. Should it one day be linked to Ibrahim Traoré, it would represent a recognition that the fight for sovereignty, independence, and dignity is a cornerstone of peace in our time. The story of Burkina Faso under Traoré is still being written. His policies are still unfolding. His leadership is still being tested, and his nation's struggles are far from resolved. Yet it is precisely in these moments of uncertainty that history often identifies its transformative figures. The Nobel Prize, though controversial, is less about perfection and more about trajectory, about recognizing those who shift the course of humanity toward greater justice. Whether or not Traoré ultimately receives such an honor, the fact that his name is even considered speaks volumes about the shifting tides of our world. As we look toward 2025, the nomination of Ibrahim Traoré raises profound questions. What does it mean to be a peacemaker in an age of economic exploitation and political dependency? Can sovereignty itself be a form of peace? And if the Nobel Prize is truly meant to honor those who transform the world toward justice, can it afford to ignore leaders from the global south who challenge the entrenched powers of our time? These are not merely academic debates. They're questions that touch on the future of global governance, the dignity of nations, and the aspirations of billions of people who long for a world where their voices matter. The conversation surrounding Traoré's nomination is, in essence, a mirror reflecting humanity's crossroads. On one side stands the old order defined by dominance, dependency, and selective recognition. On the other stands a rising vision of multipolarity, justice, and self-determination. The Nobel Committee, should it truly consider his name, will not merely be evaluating one man, but will be making a statement about which vision of peace it wishes to endorse for the 21st century. Thus, whether one supports or opposes Ibrahim Traoré's potential candidacy, one cannot deny the significance of this moment. It represents the intersection of history, politics, and morality, where the struggles of a small West African nation resonate across the globe. And as the people of Burkina Faso continue to fight for their future under his leadership, the world must decide whether peace is defined solely by the absence of conflict or by the presence of justice, dignity, and sovereignty. If the Nobel Prize of 2025 were to bear the name of Ibrahim Traoré, it would not only honor a man, but also a movement, a generation, and a continent that is rising to claim its rightful place in the story of humanity. And in that recognition, the world might finally begin to understand that peace is not a gift granted by the powerful, but a right claimed by the determined.